Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 316. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today, maybe also a data-driven approach, because I've got a returning champion to the podcast from Less Impressed, More Involved, and also now from Outlier DB, I've got Jake Luigi. Jake, how is it going, sir?
I'm doing well. I wouldn't say I'm a champion. I pretty much have no accolades, but thank you for the introduction, Steve. It's good to be back.
You know what? I normally describe people who have come back as returning champions. Chris Paynes was on recently, and I called him a repeat offender instead, and I'm not sure he appreciated that. So we'll go with returning champion today.
I'll take it.
Maybe for those who have missed your prior appearance or don't know you from the channel, why don't you tell everyone just a little bit about yourself and where they might be familiar with your brand?
Yeah, so my name's Jake. I'm a purple belt in Jiu-Jitsu, and I started the YouTube channel of Less Impressed, More Involved, I think about 3 years ago now, because that's how long we've been out on the island of Lanai. It's a small Hawaiian island, and basically started the YouTube channel as a way for myself to stay involved with Jiu-Jitsu, and it's become more popular than I could have imagined. So yeah, that's kind of how we got to where we are now.
Nice. And it's been a while since you were on the main feed last time. Premium subscribers will be more familiar with you because you've done premium content for us there. But for people who only know you from the main feed and maybe haven't heard from you since the last time we talked, let's talk about Outlier, because you never got a chance to plug this here. And I'd love to explain to people what this is. I think it's going to be very relevant to the topic at hand today. So probably best to set a foundation.
Yeah, sure. So I guess without getting too deep into it, for my YouTube videos, I watch a lot of match footage and I watch a lot of instructional content, and my notes were kind of all over the place. So I talked with a developer about making it potentially like more organized on like a website. So initially it was basically like just, my notes and trying to keep things organized. So it would allow me to make better YouTube videos more efficiently. And then it kind of turned into a product now that we're offering that is hoping to solve that information overload problem that we're going to dive into today.
Yeah, awesome. So let's talk about that a little bit. Then we can maybe circle back around and talk about the data-driven approach and how that factors in. But we've been discussing what would be a good topic for you especially to talk about here on the podcast. And the thing that I feel myself is a major problem in the sport right now, and I know a lot of our listeners feel, is this feeling of just information overload. And maybe if we want to be more specific, content overload. There is just an embarrassment of riches out there when it comes to jiu-jitsu and how you can augment your training and learn more from people outside of just your coach. I mean, when I started jiu-jitsu, there wasn't that much out there. There was the Fightworks podcast. I remember listening to that when I was a white or a blue belt. That was pretty much it. There wasn't much going on. Now it seems like every black belt in the world has their own podcast or YouTube channel. It feels like the IBJJF must have made this a certification requirement or something, because the amount of black belts who are putting that content out there, most of them not even charging, it is just very overwhelming. And this creates a bit of a Netflix problem, I guess, where there's so much stuff that it's hard to even know where to start. I don't know if you ever have this problem, but sometimes, I got the night off, I'm sitting down, I turn on Netflix and I'm like, what am I going to watch? And Netflix throws 10,000 things at me. And by the time I've figured out what I actually want to watch and I've sorted through that, that's a project in and of itself. Now I'm in a situation where I run out of time and I got to go to bed. So I think in jiu-jitsu, we run into the same thing where it's just, and I know as a content creator, you probably feel this as well. You're constantly competing with everyone else just for eyeballs and attention. And for the poor people in the audience, it just becomes a matter of overload, overstimulation. And this all raises the question of, is this even really an effective way to learn? To just get bombarded with more and more stuff? But with that said, I will turn that over to you because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it kind of comes back to the idea of decision fatigue. And like you hear some successful like CEOs wear the same thing every day to just limit the number of decisions they have to make. And with the amount of content out there, you're like have to decide which position to focus on, what techniques from that position, what instructors you want to learn from, if you want to watch instructional content or match footage. There's just like so many decisions to make before you can actually start even like diving into whatever you want to study. So I've actually been thinking a lot about my process and trying to make it a bit more defined. And yeah, in preparation for this podcast, I tried to like sit down and think about how I actually go about this stuff to overcome this problem. So yeah, if you're interested, we can kind of dive into how I go about it. But yeah, that's kind of what I think it comes down to, is trying to eliminate that decision fatigue and kind of just like structure things in a way where people know like the general realm they should be in at a given stage that they are in studying a given position. And I don't know if I'm being too clear when I'm saying that, but yeah, that's kind of where my mind goes when trying to solve this problem.
Well, let's talk about that then. I would love to hear more about your method. The thing I've always loved about your content is I kind of look at it like a meta-analysis of jiu-jitsu. Again, if the problem that so many people have is just running out of time to watch all of the stuff that they're quote unquote supposed to watch, it becomes tremendously valuable to have someone who can kind of aggregate that and give you a summary, right? Sort of like a meta study of here's what 20 of the top studies say, right? Just summarized, to represent that information so that people can get the key lesson out of it. And then if they want to, they can choose to go off and dig deeper. I think is a missing piece in the jiu-jitsu educational puzzle. At BJJ Mental Models, I've always tried to keep things relatively high level. And if people want to go into the reads, they can go to other services, other instructionals, or they can join premium. And then we've got specific content that digs deeper. But I think there is a lot of value in being able to summarize the findings of other people out there. And so I'd love to hear more about this method from you, because that's probably, I would assume, why most people watch your content, right? If they watch a less impressed, more involved video, they are going to get the benefit of you having gone off and spending hours and hours and hours studying instructionals and matches to really see what's actually working at the highest levels, as we say, and then to kind of summarize that so then people can go off and dig deeper if they feel so inclined. But yeah, tell me about the method here. I would love to learn more.
Yeah, you know, I'm lucky enough to make a career now out of analyzing jiu-jitsu, so I have a lot of time to sift through a lot of information. But even with all that time, I don't watch nearly all the content out there. You know, it's just so much. So yeah, I guess like from what I kind of got out of like sitting down and kind of diving into what I normally do. And then actually I recently made like a few videos about De La Riva, trying to go through this process to kind of make sure this is what I do. So basically, to kind of get the ball rolling, you have to pick a like given position that you want to study. So as a student, typically the way I would pick a position would be the opposite of whatever the coach is teaching in class. So if we're learning like side control escapes, then I would focus my attention on studying attacks from side control outside of class. So the idea behind that is when we do like positional rounds or games from side control, I'll be able to work on things from both top and bottom position. So that's typically how I approached picking a position as a student. But then as a coach, you get a lot more freedom and you get to kind of like pick what you want to do. So the way I've honestly done this is just picking whatever I'm interested in at the time. And like Levi was just really, really good from De La Riva in CJI, and Kynan from ADCC was just smashing everyone from De La Riva in headquarters. So De La Riva was something that was kind of piqued my interest. So that's what I decided to focus on after CJI and ADCC. So that, I guess, is how I like to just get the ball rolling and like pick a position to work on without spending too much time like trying to analyze everything, to just get started down the process of studying.
So this raises an interesting question then, because it sounds like when you're beginning this process of picking an area of study, you don't necessarily know where this is going to go. And you might not even have a grand goal for what you want to learn, but rather you've started it with the end in mind here. You've made an observation based on what you've seen about what's happening in competition. And it sounds like you're not actually working towards a specific technique. Like you're not looking into how to play, I don't know, DLX guard or something like that, but rather you're just kind of digging deep, almost reverse engineering that person's journey. It sounds like the person that you have been studying and trying to figure out how they got to where they got. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's relatively correct. Yeah, like it could be a specific sequence. Like Levi had like a really cool entry into the legs against Roberto Jimenez in CJI, and that like blew my mind. And I was like, man, I want to learn more about this. And it was set up from De La Riva. So yeah, like it can kind of start with inspiration from like a given sequence, but then you kind of like reverse engineer it. Yeah. And then be like, where did this originate from? And then you dive into like that specific position. And then like towards the end, you can kind of work into that specific technique.
Got it. Now, how do you even know where to start though? Sometimes it's obvious because you'll be watching, again, a high profile match and there will be one thing in particular that maybe stands out. But how do you even make that first decision about where to spend your time? I think that's where people often get hung up, is they get paralyzed on the initial decision. We always talk about the importance of training with intention and having a plan when you go into class about something to work on. And that's something that I think most people have probably heard, but very few people actually do. And I would definitely want to hear your thoughts on how you pick something like that. Is there something you're looking for when it comes to how you decide what to study? And I bring this up because many people, I think they probably would look internally for something like that. Maybe they would feel like, my De La Riva is not good, so I want to work on that. But it sounds like what you're doing is you're looking a lot at what's working out there in the broader community and then pulling lessons from there rather than looking so much at your own game.
Yeah, so I imagine this is different, like if you're a very high level competitor. But for me, at least, it kind of, like you said, a lot of people get hung up on this step and then they never actually like dive into something because they're too worried that they pick the wrong thing. And it just kind of leads to them spinning in circles. So like generally for me, I don't try to get too caught up in like whether or not I'm focusing on the like correct in quotation marks thing. Like if something's interesting to me and it makes me excited to go to jiu-jitsu, then I'm going to study that. And just because most of my study comes from watching match footage, like if you're someone who doesn't watch match footage, then your inspiration might come from your own training. But for me, a lot of my inspiration comes from watching people. And then I get super excited about a given position. And then that's what I decide to study for the next month or two. So yeah, I personally think this isn't as important of a decision as it's like portrayed to be. As long as you pick something, like at the end of the day, you pretty much have to be well-rounded these days in jiu-jitsu. So as long as you just pick something that interests you and makes you excited to go to training, I think that's a great place to start.
That's interesting because what you're saying is that picking a thing is more important than picking the right thing. And it sounds like the big point you're trying to drive home is that it doesn't really matter if you've picked the quote unquote most optimal thing to study. The most important thing is to pick something and then just to drive forward with it. Is that correct?
Yeah, like I've been studying a lot of business stuff lately as well. And kind of the theme I've been taking away from a lot of the books I've been reading is you don't want to spend 3 months building something that you think is correct and then you launch it and then the users of it are like, yeah, this isn't exactly like what we want. We'd rather use it like in this manner. And now you've spent a bunch of time building what you thought was correct, but in reality it wasn't correct because you never put it in front of your users. So in terms of jiu-jitsu, you could spend months and months trying to like figure out the best like technique or position to study. And then when you finally get into it, you realize that it doesn't actually like work the way you thought it would work. And you kind of need to like go back and take a step back and potentially like reassess your decision making. And in my opinion, it's better to just like pick something, move forward with it, and get in the training room like right away and start like playing with it. So then you get immediate feedback and then you can change direction accordingly based on that feedback you're getting. But spending so much time and like just trying to decide where to even start, in my opinion, is not the best way to approach the problem.
You're speaking my language here, buddy. That was my job for many, many decades working in the software world. And you're completely right. A common problem that happens in product development is spending too long on the building phase before you actually start to get feedback and see how people even respond. One of the problems with us being human beings is that we always see things from our own perspective. And no matter how much we try to empathize and look at things from another person's point of view, we can only ever really see the world through our own eyes. And all of our biases, of which there are many, are going to jade and color our thinking. So a common problem when you're building something like a new software product is you might think you know what the user really wants and what is going to resonate, but you don't really know. You just have theories. And very often, maybe more often than not, those theories are going to prove to be incomplete or wrong. And so modern software development practices tell us that rather than going off into a lab and spending a year building something and then showing it to people a year later, you want to cut that lag time. You want to get things in front of customers as soon as possible, even if it's not perfect or not complete, and get feedback. Because the worst thing that happens is you spend more time than is necessary on a dead-end idea. Dead-end ideas are normal. They're unavoidable when you're trying to grow or build. You can never really plan around them entirely. No matter how good your plan, you're always going to hit dead ends here and there. The only way to really know if you're going to hit them and to avoid wasting time in those directions is to get feedback quickly and early. So in the software world, modern practices use a methodology that is called Agile, which is derived actually from manufacturing many, many years ago. And the idea is rather than going off and building something without feedback, we get feedback rapidly and we reserve the right to pivot and change plans based on that feedback. And Jiu-Jitsu very much has a parallel because people often think about the way they learn Jiu-Jitsu the way that people might have built software many, many decades ago, which could arguably be suboptimal, which is they're not getting feedback enough. That's one of the great things about competition is it's immediate feedback. So if you go out and try something, or if someone else does, you will see right away what the result is and you can pivot based on that. But if you spend all of your time trying to design the perfect game, but you never actually take the time to pressure test it, you can wind up in a situation I've been in before, which is you spend like 8 months working on something and then you go out there and you get feedback and you realize, you know what? I wasted 7 of those 8 months and I wish I had a time machine and I could go back and get this feedback earlier. So I think that's a great point in jiu-jitsu because people do get completely paralyzed by the decisions that they have to make, just the abundance of content out there. And sometimes it's hard for them to even know where to get started. I see on Reddit, for example, so many threads about should I sign up for Submeta or should I sign up for BJJ Concepts or BJJ Mental Models Premium, right? And often the advice is just pick something and move, right? You don't need to be so concerned about calling the perfect shot and studying the perfect meta thing because you don't actually know how that's going to translate on the fly to your jiu-jitsu. You don't know what's going to happen in the world out there. So I think that's great advice about getting feedback earlier.
Yeah, it's that Toyota manufacturing model. But yeah, I fell into this trap with our first iterations of the Outlier database because the whole goal of the website is to solve that decision fatigue problem and just kind of like give people information that they want, like right at the click of a button. And I made the mistake of posting on my Discord, asking like what people thought would be cool to track. And we were tracking like people's wingspans, people's heights, like the weights, like so many things because we thought it would be cool to see like which techniques or guard passes tend to work for people who have longer wingspans versus shorter wingspans. And then this led to having so many options and like filter options and things like this when using the website that it led to so many decisions people had to make before they actually were able to see content. So like we spent so much time building what we thought people would think was like cool, but then when we launched it, it was like people thought it was just overwhelming, the amount of choices they had to make before seeing content. So now with that feedback, we're working on a new redesign now that'll be available in a couple months. But yeah, that's I hear you. A lot of time wasted chasing dead ends.
Yeah. Part of the problem right now is there's a bit of a paradox of abundance with jiu-jitsu content where there's just so much stuff out there and you might think more is better, but having more creates another series of problems that you don't get when you have scarcity. One is it's just very hard where to know to start. And human beings are not good at making decisions. I mean, we're fundamentally lazy. We like to save cognitive cycles and not burn energy and brain power if we can avoid it. And the more options you put in front of someone, as you talked about, the more you discourage them from getting started. This is a common thing that you see in user experience design when people are building applications. The more hurdles that you put up, like the more information you ask people to provide, the more steps you ask them to go through, the less likely they are to stick around. I mean, there's very interesting data that you can look at if you present a form to someone and you ask them to fill it in. If you just ask for their email, you're going to get one amount of information. But if you start asking for other info like their name, their address or whatever, the more you ask, the less likely it is they're going to fill that out. Now, part of that, of course, is that people might just not want to share that information. But another part of that is that the more hurdles you put up, the less likely it is you're going to get people to take the action that you want them to. And that doesn't even get into the quality situation, right? There's so much content out there right now that I think a big problem that we face is being able to tell which is good and which is bad, because you often don't know that until you actually dig in and start watching that. When there's tens of thousands of videos that you could choose to watch out there, you often don't even really know if something is going to be good until you start digging in. And I mean, yes, it's great that we have more jiu-jitsu content. There's more good content than ever, but there's also much, much more bad content than ever. And this kind of poisons the well and makes it hard for an average grappler to know, like, am I learning from a good source or am I learning from a garbage source? And that in turn, people then will start using mental shortcuts. Like if they see that Danaher said it, they'll just immediately gravitate towards that, which isn't bad. But it does mean that they might be closing their mind to a lot of other great content out there simply because they don't have the cognitive bandwidth to sort through all of this stuff and figure out who's legit and who's not.
Right. So if I'm studying a given position, like let's use De La Riva, I'll try to watch instructional content to just kind of get a lay of the land and figure out what details, or not details, but like battles or variables seem to be important from a given position. So when you're doing that, a lot of times you get conflicting advice. So like Lachlan might say one thing and then Gordon says another, both of which are, in my opinion, very valid sources, but there's like directly conflicting information. So it does make it difficult. So in my opinion, my study process is I start with instructionals to get a lay of the land of the position and figure out what I'm looking at. And let's say I decide that I want to focus on the grip someone has on the leg from De La Riva. I want to focus on the opponent's posture, so whether they're standing or down on a knee. And I want to focus on the direction of attack from the guard player, whether they're spinning around to the outside or trying to go in between their opponent's legs. So basically, I just like find these variables to focus on from watching the instructional content and seeing how they manipulate these variables to achieve the given techniques they're showing. So yeah, like I said, that's basically how I start, but then you get conflicting information in those instructionals. So then I go and at least the best way I know how to do this is start with instructionals to get the lay of the land. And then I watch a ton of match footage and I just pay attention to those variables that I decided to focus on and see what grip people are using on the leg, their like the posture of their opponent, and then the direction that they're trying to attack. And then I try and see different trends and kind of formulate my own opinion about which one I think is. They're probably both correct, but like whether or not I agree more with Gordon or Lachlan, and try and form my own opinion based on the match footage that I'm watching. So that tends to be how I study a given position.
Makes sense. And it sounds like a big part of what you're doing is you're looking for underlying themes between all of these lessons rather than maybe the specifics, which I think is smart because when you're talking about specifics, often these can vary depending on the person's attributes, like their body type, how big they are, how strong they are, and also strategic things like what other positions and techniques is this person good at. If they have a game plan that naturally funnels into a specific thing, or if they've got other things that they can do if that thing fails, if their game plan synergizes with the way they're doing it, it might make more sense to do, I don't know, the armbar their way. Whereas if you have a different series of attributes and a different game plan, maybe there's another type of armbar that can funnel into your game plan better. This is something that people don't often talk a lot about in jiu-jitsu. They kind of assume there is like one right technical way to do a move, but often it comes down to what does your jiu-jitsu ecosystem look like? What's your overall strategy and game plan? Because if you're doing a technique a certain way, you want to make sure that whether you get it or you don't, that is going to integrate into the rest of your game plan. And whether it succeed or fail, that it puts you in a position that you're still going to be comfortable and powerful in. And that's going to vary tremendously depending on the person and what their preferences are and what kind of stuff they're good at.
Yeah, exactly. So if I'm studying a given position, in my opinion, I think the best way to see the like functionality of that position and kind of the cohesiveness of that like system or game that you're talking about is you can watch a specific athlete and then see how they play that position and how they kind of build their overall game from that position. But again, I think watching match footage is not the most beneficial at the start. Like if you just like start out like, oh, I want to start studying De La Riva and you just start watching match footage, I just think there's too much to look at and it can kind of lead to that like overwhelm problem. Like, okay, like he's being successful, but I'm not entirely sure exactly what I'm looking at. So I think it's really important to start with the instructionals with the goal of just like giving yourself some variables that you think are important. So then when you watch the match footage, all you're really looking at is those variables and how they're manipulating those variables to be successful.
Yeah. It sounds like a big part of this is just getting the context rather than going in and trying to memorize every single detail that the person's doing, to sort of understand the why behind why they're doing what they're doing. And then from there, you have a broader context to understand when you actually watch the match, what's actually happening and why they might be doing what they've done versus why someone else might do a different thing.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Greg Sodders and he gave me like a very nice framework that I tend to see things through these days. And basically what he said is when you propose a solution, it needs to be based on the effect that you're trying to create and then ultimately the function of that effect. So like, for example, if you're saying from De La Riva, instead of taking like a standard grip, you want to take a scoop grip or an underhook De La Riva. And you just say that, but you don't say like the effect that you want that grip to create, then it doesn't give you a very good understanding of the proposed solution that you're offering. So these days when I'm trying to make a YouTube video or dive into a problem, I'm really trying to frame the solution that I'm proposing based on the effect that solution is trying to create.
Yeah, that was a big breakthrough for me, understanding that looking at the result and letting people work backwards on their own is just such a powerful way to get good at jiu-jitsu. I mean, that's a great example as well of where you're avoiding overly rote technical detail. And I agree with you. I see this very often with instructors where when they're trying to teach a student how to do something, they won't necessarily explain why they should be trying to do something or explain what the goal is. They will just talk about it in very descriptive ways, such as put your hand here, put your foot here, pull here. It's all a series of steps. And those can be very hard to follow. First of all, because everyone's body is different. I mean, you talked about Greg Sodders, right? One of the things that Ecological Dynamics teaches us is that no two people ever do a technique the same way. And even within a single person, they will never do the same technique the exact same way twice. There's always different variables. And so to some extent, you're always kind of freewheeling it and making it up as you go. So if you think of jiu-jitsu in terms of what are all of the steps I have to follow, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure because that's not how it actually works. It's more important to know what are really the objectives here? Like, what should I be trying to force my opponent to do? Where should I be trying to put my body? Kind of thinking of things at a higher level. That's a big part of why we started doing BJJ mental models the way that we do, is because I sort of realized at some point that trying to learn jiu-jitsu by memorizing technical details for my instructor was sort of a losing battle. And it wasn't until I started trying to really focus on like, what's the actual objective here? What am I trying to achieve? And then letting myself fill in the details, I found that just to be a much better way to learn and to get good quick. And I think that, again, like you said, cuts through a lot of the noise that can be created by having so many instructionals out there. If you can kind of distill down the why behind why we're doing these things and not get so focused on the how.
Yeah. With that said, I do think the technical details are important for refining the solution that you ultimately propose. So like generally, I kind of like sandwich instructionals, if that makes sense. So like I'll start my study process with instructionals to just try and get those variables that I want to focus on. And then I'll watch a lot of match footage. And then after I propose a solution. Then I'll go back to instructionals and I'll try and pick up on some of the finer details that might make the execution of the proposed solution easier or more effective against high level resistance. So that tends to be the way I approach it. Like the foundation is the effect that you're trying to create, but then ultimately you kind of revisit the instructionals and try and see how people are teaching the proposed solution that you're trying to study. And the finer details can help in the execution of that proposed solution.
Yeah. We had Charles Harriott on the podcast recently, and he was talking about how he looks at jiu-jitsu through the lens of a threefold view. You've got kind of the high level, the mid-level, and then the on-the-ground, super detailed under the microscope level. And you do need all of these. It's just a matter of which is going to be most helpful at any given point. There always will come a point when you're really nerding out about something that you really do need to actually sit down and look at, okay, why does this person have their left hand 1 inch higher than I do, right? That absolutely does come up. But like you mentioned, those are usually refinements. They're usually things that you study after you've kind of got a basis for what is this thing and how to do it at a general level. Then it makes sense to go and explore the hyper details. Whereas the mistake that many people make when they're learning, I think, is they get so focused on the hyper details that they never abstract that away and look at things at a higher level. My preference, and this is just me, is to always kind of be switching up and down between these different levels of granularity. So I want someone to tell me, why are you doing something? But I also want them to show me, what does it look like? And then I want some time to actually practice it and feel it out and figure out how to make it work for myself. But once I get competent enough at something, I'm going to start hitting a wall. You know, if I'm doing stuff on white and blue belts, that's one thing, but then you're always going to hit that phase where you try it on a black belt and it just doesn't work. And that's often when you start going and looking at the micro details. Like, what are the things that high level athletes are doing that are just a tiny bit different from me? And do those things also make sense for me to do? And that's important to point out as well, because due to body types, it might not make sense for you to do the things that other people are doing, or it might even not be possible in some cases, depending on body dimensions. But you still want to at least evaluate that, because again, every once in a while, you'll pick out a nugget, you'll find a lesson there and you'll realize, oh my goodness, if I had just done what this person's doing here, I could make this thing way more effective. And you never find that information unless you actually go looking for it. So I think there definitely is a place to pull out the microscope and break things down at super granular detail. But I think that, again, a mistake that so many coaches make is they focus almost entirely on that, and they never really sit down people and explain the strategy or the concept behind why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I guess kind of the purpose of our conversation so far has been to give people who are struggling to study jiu-jitsu outside of class on their own just a kind of like layout that will hopefully help with that decision fatigue. So when you decide on a position to work on, what I like to do is I don't look at match footage. I don't look at anything else. I first start with instructionals or like YouTube content or whatever, to just get an idea of what I'm looking at. And then like I said previously, like get the idea. And then once you have the idea, watch the match footage. And then once you have a proposed solution that you see tends to be working well, then revisit instructionals. So in my opinion, this has helped me a lot in terms of like just not spinning my wheels and like deciding I'm going to work on De La Hiva and then spending a couple days trying to find match footage of the position and then being like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. Now I need to go like, watch instructionals or whatever. So hopefully this framework helps people just kind of see where, at least in my opinion, the tools available to us fit in to the overall study of a given position.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Do you plan this stuff out while you're doing study? I mean, I'd love to know more about your method. If you want to learn something new, do you just kind of go and crawl away into your office and lock the door and just watch instructionals for 12 hours? Or do you actually plot stuff out with pen and paper? I'm just trying to figure out how involved is this method, and are you producing other artifacts like notes while you do it?
Yeah, so I would say like the step-by-step procedure, I haven't laid out until this last month. And then I recently made a couple videos that I'll launch a bit later, but kind of like testing it out. But yeah, like up until then, it was just kind of more like fly by the seat of my pants and waste a lot of time doing this. But yeah, I take notes, and those notes exist now in the Outlier database. And it's just an easy way for me to search and reference notes. And basically the way we kind of structured it is I'll take notes on a given study resource, like a YouTube video or an instructional. And then as I'm going through match footage, I'll say like, oh, this sequence in this match was a good example of what Danaher was talking about in this instructional. And there's a way for us to link those together. So now when I'm going back to revisit the instructional and, dive deeper into it, I'll have 6 examples from matches that I can see what Danaher's talking about happening in the match. So I can just study it right there. Makes it easy, connects everything together. So I would say my study process has gotten a lot more efficient with the database. But yeah, that's kind of the way I go about it, is I take notes on a given instructional, mostly around the variables that I think are important to focus on. And then I'll go watch the match footage and I'll link the match footage with those variables and notes from the instructional content. And then when I revisit the instructional, it's already all there for me to like see the match footage and the detailed explanation from Danaher on how to make it work.
I love how we're just picking on Danaher. We're talking about how stuff is so complicated, and we just assume it must be Danaher that we're discussing here.
Or Lachlan, pick a name.
Yeah. Now, this makes me ask, though, when you're generating these notes, are these notes that you ever come back and revisit, or are the notes just an artifact for planning where they're kind of one and done? You use them to organize your thoughts and to move on, but then afterwards they just go in the trash. They're never something you consult. Or are you one of those people who periodically revisits their notes?
So before the database, I would pretty much I would never revisit my notes. I would just trash them. But now they exist forever in the database. So like if I'm making a video, like I would say I revisit my notes more when I'm making a video about a given event, if that makes sense. So like if I watch like a Fight Pass invitational event or something like that, and then a sequence happens and I know I studied it 6 months ago, it's easy for me to find the notes and reference that position so I can just talk about it again in the video about that given event. Because the videos about events tend to be a bit more sporadic because, random techniques happen in events that I want to talk about. Whereas videos that are focused like solely on a position tend to be like newer notes that I'm making in the moment. So it won't necessarily require me to go back and revisit other notes that I have taken as much. I still do it for sure, just to kind of see where my base was before this next round of studying. But I would say I revisit notes more when I'm making a video that's a bit more like sporadic and maybe about like a given event, if that makes sense.
I would love to know here, when we talk about these two different types of content, on one hand, you've got instructional content, which is where someone has sit down and they've got a lesson they're trying to communicate to you. It's curated. Ideally, it's been thought through and it's been presented in a way that the instructor believes accurately represents everything that you would need to know about this position. But it's also fake, right? I mean, when they record an instructional, it's not a live environment. They're just sitting there talking. I mean, they could be telling you anything. And if you don't know any better, it's hard for a layperson who's maybe new to jiu-jitsu to tell, is this stuff legit or not? On the other hand, when you watch competition, I mean, you're looking at things that actually happened. And so there's a level of nuance there that you just won't get from an instructional because you're seeing the other person try to resist, right? And that changes a lot. So there's a different type of lesson you can learn. But the other thing that you bring up is the problem with competition footage is sometimes you just don't get anything of value because you can't control what's going to happen, right? It might be that one guy pulls guard and then they stall for 5 minutes and that's the entire match and you didn't learn anything. How do you balance these two types of content, the curated, prepared instructional versus the on-the-fly chaos that is a competition match? And do you see any pros and cons to studying one versus the other?
To be honest, I don't necessarily think there's too much value in studying the event type content. I tend to make those videos as more of like, one, they're easier, honestly, for me to make. And then two, it just kind of like is what people are interested. So, you get more eyeballs if you kind of make the video about the recent event that happened or whatever. But for me, I think that the real value, if you're looking to study, is in seeing many examples happen from a given position, and you can start to pick out trends that you're seeing. I don't necessarily think there's too much value in the sense, unless you're thinking of in terms of like the overall game and like game plan from a match, then yeah, like definitely watching like full events might be valuable. But as far as like just getting better at a specific area. You could watch a whole event and see like 2 examples happen from De La Riva after watching 6 hours of competition footage, you know? So yeah, this is basically the problem we're trying to solve with the database, and that there's no real tool for studying match footage where you can just say like De La Riva and see 74 examples of De La Riva happening in competition against live resistance. So this is the problem that we're solving with the database.
What do you think of athlete commentary on their own matches? So in this day and age, one of the cool things is that there's so much access to the athletes performing. You can often find them breaking down their own matches and saying what they were planning to do. Do you find that to be a really reliable or useful source of information? And do you use that a lot, or do you try to do your own assessment? And I ask because from my experience, often athletes, they either don't really know what it was that they did that worked. They kind of just intuited it on the fly, or maybe they're not giving you the full story because there's some secret game plan in there that they want to reuse in the future. So I'd love to know, do you find value in the athlete's own words where they explain what their competition strategy was, or do you like to analyze it yourself?
I love it. I normally honestly wait to make videos until I hear athletes go on podcasts and stuff like that to try and get a peek into what they were thinking about in preparation for it, the strategy they were going into the match with. And then if they break down like specific sequences, that's great too. But I love it. I think it's great that athletes do that. And probably one of the more useful thing about Gordon Ryan's instructionals is the rolling commentary at the end, where he rolls with a bunch of people and then comments over it saying like, this is what I was thinking. This is the battle that was taking place from this position. And this dude flared his elbow. So I went into this technique as opposed to doing like a different technique, you know? So just, in my opinion, it's great to get an insight into like what they're looking at and the variables they think are important from that position and what they're focused on in the heat of the moment. I think it gives you a tremendous insight into what's important to look at when you're studying that position.
Got it. You know, on the topic of specific coaches and athletes out there, do you have anyone that you would consider a universal recommendation? So if someone comes to you and they want to get better at jiu-jitsu, is there anyone where you would say, hey, look, it doesn't matter if you're a white belt or a black belt or a hobbyist or a pro, you have to study this person? Anyone that's universal, or do you feel that there's just too much variability to make a claim like that?
I think everyone has, like, there's so many people with Patreons these days. There's so many YouTube videos. There's so many instructors out there that are giving content away. And I wouldn't make a generic recommendation like that. Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah.
I'm in the same boat. My feeling is that, yes, there are incredible coaches out there, but there's more at play than just how much the coach knows. There's a lot of other variables at the human level that we don't talk about enough. I mean, for example, my number one recommendation for people who are, you know, they got $20 a month to spend and they want a video library. My number one recommendation for most people is probably going to be Submeta, just because it's high production quality. Obviously, we can vouch for Lachlan, and it's what I would consider to be probably the most complete video library, just in terms of the breadth of what it covers. So it's like, odds are you're probably going to find something there that'll help you. But at the same time, we're human beings, and there's a lot of people who just might not resonate with Lachlan's coaching style. I know, for example, there's many other people where I would say, you know what, you're probably better off going to BJJ Concepts or something like that, because it depends on what specifically they need at any given point in time. And it also depends on the way that they interpret the instructor. There's some instructors that, I mean, they might not technically be the quote unquote highest level instructor, but I just find them easier to understand. And I think that matters a lot. So one of the things that I observe is we get so focused in jiu-jitsu about chasing what's really happening at the highest levels. And sometimes what happens is we neglect to pay attention to everyone else. So people will often say, well, Gordon is number one, Danaher is his coach, so therefore they will be my only sources of information. And of course, they're going to be good sources of information, but that doesn't mean that, depending on where you are at the time, it's the best possible option for you. There might be some guy out there who's publishing stuff on YouTube, who's got 1,000 followers, but the way that they communicate just resonates better with you, and the stuff they're teaching is more applicable for your level where you're at right now. You touched on this earlier, and how you feel it's possible to get analysis paralysis and focus too much on trying to study the quote unquote highest levels. What are your thoughts on this in terms of where you studied? Do you always look at like what Gordon is doing and what's going on at the absolute highest levels? Or are you taking a broader scope and looking at what some maybe lesser known instructors are teaching as well?
I would say I made my name off of studying Gordon and Danaher. So I do think there is value in not necessarily picking like, the correct, in quotation marks, instructor, but like once you pick someone, I think it's good to kind of like dive deep into their stuff and study a lot of their like content, just so you can understand the lens that they see jiu-jitsu through, and you can kind of speak their language a bit more. And once you kind of understand the lens, then I think it's good to branch out and see where other people don't necessarily see through that same lens. And it kind of just like opens up perspectives more. But yeah, in my opinion, kind of going back to the decision fatigue kind of thing, it's easy to just pick the top level instructor and kind of just take their word for stuff. But again, I personally think match footage is the best way to decide and form an opinion for yourself. And I think you do this after you can like see through someone's lens, if that makes sense. So I would say my personal process is I tend to study a lot of like competition footage, and what tends to be competition footage is like the high level stuff. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not, but yeah, that's kind of where my mind went when you asked me.
Well, I mean, you'll always do well by looking at what's going on at the highest levels. But my point is more that it can become a problem then to neglect other stuff because you get so hyper-focused on one person. That said, though, something you touched on, which I think is worth expanding on here, is the idea of going deep with a particular coach. The problem with the way that we interact with so much online content is we're kind of samplers. We go broad, but we don't go deep very often anymore. And I think a big part of that is just because when there's so much stuff out there, we kind of have constant FOMO. Because if I spend 2 months studying Gordon's latest instructional, that's 2 months that I can't spend studying Danaher's latest instructional, right? So when you pick a shot, when you choose what to study, by definition, you're excluding other things. And people don't like to do that. They want to feel like more. And so quite often, I think people will just consume this steady intake of content as it gets suggested and recommended to them, but there isn't really an overlying theme amongst it. They're not really taking the time to absorb it. And they're definitely, as you mentioned, not taking the time to really understand that particular coach. I guess an example I would give is, do you think your jiu-jitsu would really get amazing if rather than seeing the same coach every day, you just did a drop-in with a completely different stranger every single time you went to class? I mean, you'd get better, but there is, I think, value in having a consistent coach who knows you and who can give you context. Because if I've been training with this coach for a year and I've already been to dozens of sessions with them, when they teach something new, I understand how that's going to tie into what they've taught me before. Whereas if I watch an instructional with someone for the first time and I've never heard them speak before, I don't have that presumed knowledge. So I think the problem with going overly broad is you don't get that opportunity to dig deep. And also, if it's a real coaching relationship and not just instructionals, you're not giving the coach the time to learn about you and how they can help you and maybe what your game looks like. So something I've heard a lot of high performers talk about, my coach Emily Kwok talks about this quite often, is how it's good to go deep onto something and to kind of pick an area and to really focus on that and give it the time and the breathing room that it deserves if you want to get good at it. Whereas I think sometimes the way that people consume instructionals is they can't wait to get through it so that they can move on to the next thing. And they're not really watching it more than once. In fact, odds are they probably weren't watching it to completion the first time anyway. And they're really unlikely to actually go and intentionally and consciously create a game plan around how to learn that skill and then come back and revisit it. And I feel like sometimes maybe people would be better off doing that, rather than trying to buy every instructional and watch it once. They might be better off picking one good one and then just spending 2 months of their life just unpacking and trying to apply that and figuring out how to actually turn that into action.
Yeah, I think we are just instinctually have just like a constant desire for novelty, just as human beings. And this, I think, is one downside to like going back to where we talked about just like picking a position to work on and not investing too much time and like making sure it's the correct position, but just like, pick something and go for it, study it. And being super lackadaisical with that decision can potentially lead to you not being like super invested in that decision. And then when something new and novel comes along, you're more easily swayed off the path because you didn't spend months and months basically developing that conviction behind your decision to work on a given position, So I would say this is one potential downside of being super lackadaisical about the position that you choose to work on. So in my opinion, I just try and be aware that this is kind of just like a human condition and realize that there's going to be some shiny objects, but this is a given position that I elected to work on. And maybe I'll spend 80% of my time focused on that position of choice, but then I'll give myself 20% to just like see what's going on in these other newer areas just for fun. And so to kind of like fulfill that human desire of FOMO, that's how I approach it, at least.
It makes quite a bit of sense, man. Well, for people who are struggling with content overload, one of the cool things about your work is it does a really good job of summarizing it. So your YouTube channel, Less Impressed, More Involved, is, like I said, it's a great meta-analysis of what's actually happening in the sport. I've always kind of likened it to like a Coles Notes for Jiu-Jitsu instructionals. If you are like me, where you're probably not willing to invest 8 hours of your life listening to Gordon or Danaher talk without really understanding what you're getting out of it, it's helpful to have a channel like yours where people can go and kind of get the essence distilled. And the other thing that you've been working on, of course, is Outlier, which is a great way to really practice what we preach in Jiu-Jitsu. Everyone always talks about how we want to follow data and be empirical in Jiu-Jitsu and study what works at the highest levels. But before Outlier, it was shockingly hard to actually answer that question. We would talk about this anecdotally, like maybe one person would see a jump guillotine at a major tournament, and suddenly everyone would be talking about the jump guillotine at the highest levels. But that's just one data point, right? And as human beings, we sometimes get anecdote conflated with data more than we should. So if someone actually wanted to know, for example, what percentage of blue belts at IBJJF tournaments win their matches via jump guillotine, that is my understanding. That's the kind of question that you're trying to solve here with Outlier. So I want to give you a moment to plug both Less Impressed, More Involved on YouTube and also Outlier for people who might not have checked it out yet.
Yeah, so when kind of getting back to where I first started talking about it, when we first launched Outlier, we were trying to solve the problem that you outlined and get super specific as far as like belt level, and even like the type of guillotine, like was it an arm-in guillotine? Was it a high-risk guillotine? Like just get like super in-depth. But now with this new update, I think we're kind of branching away from that and trying to fill the void more of providing match footage for people to study from a given position. So kind of like what we were talking about, the way I kind of see Outlier fitting in to the study process is you have watched instructional content and you have a basic idea of the position and what to look for. And now you want to see De La Riva in competition. You would just go in, type in De La Riva, and you see many examples of competition footage from De La Riva. So we are kind of branching away from the like statistics side of things and trying to focus more on providing match footage as well as instructional content as well. But primarily, I think that the void that we're filling in the space, because like there's so much instructional content out there. So I think the primary void that we're filling is for those people who have a good understanding of a given position and they want to see what that position looks like in competition. This is the void that I think we're primarily going to focus on filling, at least for the next like 6 months to a year.
Amazing, man. Well, let's plug this stuff. If people want to find it, how can they do that?
Yeah. I mean, my YouTube channel is Less Impressed, More Involved. The Outlier database is outlierdb.com. And yeah, that's basically what my life has been for the last 3 years.
Well, I will put links to those in the show notes. So if people haven't checked out your channel, I always tell people it's an easy follow. I mean, my brother as well, friend of yours too, he speaks incredibly highly of your stuff and is always one of his first recommendations. So again, Less Impressed, More Involved on YouTube. I will put a link in the show notes. I'll also put a link to Outlier. It's a very unique resource. I am not aware of any other resource out there that is quite like yours. And I think in a world where everyone's kind of gravitating towards traditional video instructional clips. It's nice to have people in the space who fill in the gaps elsewhere. So I definitely recommend people check out Outlier because it's not going to be just another video academy like you might have already subscribed to 12 times in the past. It could be a missing piece that you're looking for in terms of your understanding of the gentle art. So I will put a link to that in the show notes. I will also put a link to all of our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. Over 300 episodes now. They're all completely free. They're all intended to be timeless and educational. So I always recommend people go back and give those ones a go. And look, I know that 300 episodes is a lot. So I also always tell people, if there's something specific that you're working on or that you're struggling with, just shoot me a message on Instagram or contact me through the website. I'm always happy to help out if I can to direct you to where the best resource is going to be. Also, you can sign up for our newsletter there. It's completely free, about 12,000 people on there. I definitely recommend getting on board there because we always try to make that worth people's whiles. And the way that we pay the bills here is BJJ Mental Models Premium, closing in on around 600 subscribers there. That is ultimately what floats the boat here. It's how we can keep things ad-free. Much like Jake's service, our service is, to the best of my knowledge, one of a kind. There really isn't anyone who does what we do. We provide courses that primarily focus on concept, strategy, philosophy, tactics, mindset of Jiu-Jitsu, mostly through audio. If you like Audible, if you like Masterclass, you're probably going to love BJJ Mental Models Premium. You can also go up to the next coaching tier and we will give you direct black belt feedback from our coaching team. It's an incredible resource if you want to see someone break down your fight footage specifically or your rolling footage in the gym. We connect you with some of the best black belts in the world, people who have been on the show before, who would be happy to help you out. So you can look into our coaching tier for that. All of that lives at bjjmentalmodels.com, but I will put a link in the show notes. Jake, man, great to have you back. Thanks for this. I think this is really helpful for a lot of people. I think it addresses a very common problem that we all deal with, but no one talks about enough in jiu-jitsu. So thanks for coming by, buddy.
Thanks, Steve. Always nice talking to you.
You too, man. Thanks to the listeners as well. We'll talk to you in the next one. See you soon.